So good morning, everybody. And what I'm going to talk about today is how truly amazing hummingbirds are. As you can see from the title, a life far from ordinary. So hummingbirds are a miracle of nature. They are the second largest family of birds in the world after tyrant flycatchers, and certainly a whole lot more colorful. At today's estimate, something around 330 species. I say something around because it's changing all the time, and I've seen anything from 280 to 350 species. They have the highest wing beats and heartbeat of any bird, and I will talk about that later. But to give you an idea, their heartbeat can be up to 1,200 beats a minute, and their wing beats up to 200 times a minute. They can truly fly in any direction. So despite rumors to the contrary, hummingbirds are the only bird that can truly fly in any direction. There are lots of anecdotal stories about crows and ravens flying backwards. They're urban myths. It's not true. Hummingbirds are truly the only bird that can fly in any direction, including backwards. Someone asked me if they could fly upside down. I'm not sure too many hummingbirds have ever tried it, but not as far as I know. And they are primarily a nectar feeder. So they're often seen with colorful plants. That's why human beings like to watch them so much. Due to their own iridescence and the colorful plants they feed from. Before anyone asks, they cannot live on nectar or sugar water alone. They have to eat tiny insects for protein. And occasionally you'll see a hummingbird snap at a small flying insect or a spider. So let's talk about a little bit about hummingbird classification. Forgive me for all the Latin, but I'll try and explain as I go along. So hummingbirds are grouped together with swifts and tree swifts in an order called Apodiformes. Apodiformes in Latin means no feet. And if you ever watch a hummingbird swift, or indeed a tree swift, if you've ever seen one, it looks like they have no feet at all. In fact, they're very, very small and pretty useless. But, you know, 2 centuries ago, the Romans and when they found them, the Latin classification, they had no feet. That's split into 2 suborders, Apodi, which keeps swifts and tree swifts, and into hummingbirds, which is Trochili. And hummingbirds are actually split in 2. And there's a few pictures just to keep you interested. So swift on the left, a tree swift in the middle, and a fiery throated hummingbird on the right. Hummingbirds are split into 2. Phaethornithinii, which is the hermits, of which there are 34 species, and Trochilinae, which is a typical hummingbird and has all the other species. So to expand a little bit, here is a picture of a long-tailed hermit on the left and a rufous hummingbird on the right. They are split almost or pretty much through their iridescence. You can see on the left, the hermit flashes his color, which is pretty uniform, whatever direction you're in. A Trochilinae on the right, typically you have to be at the right angle to see the iridescence. And as you can see on the rufous hummingbird there on the right, its throat is flashing as us. I should call it a gorget, actually, not a throat. So what are the true differences other than the iridescence? Well, hermits have a lack of pigmentation. They have pendant-shaped nests, and they have a different humeral tendon, which is the tendon that controls the wings. Typical hummingbirds, very strong pigmentation, typically nest in cups on branches And again, they have a different humeral tendon to the hermits. And mostly today, we're going to talk about the typical hummingbirds. Okay, so as I say here, hummingbirds are New World wonders. They are only found in the New World. Okay, there are no hummingbirds in the Old World, no hummingbirds in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Australasia. They are only found in North and South America. And here's a few examples. What are their equivalents in the Old World? We've already seen the swifts, tree swifts, but in general, as nectar feeders, hummingbirds are replaced by what are called sunbirds. And this is a ruby-cheeked sunbird from Malaysia. So let's be very clear, if you leave the Americas, you are not seeing a hummingbird. As I said, 328 species or so in what's called a genera. There are 104 genera. Those are groups of hummingbirds that are very similar. If we look at the Americas, the greatest concentration of hummingbirds is in Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, where there are 100 to 150 species plus. That gets less as you move away from the tropics, either north or south. In Canada, you can see there are less than 10 species. In Argentina, Chile, it gets down to between 10 and 40. The US has 31, I won't say commonly occurring species, but species that regularly occur in the US. And here's a few pictures. The one on the left is a calliope hummingbird, and as you'll see, is the smallest hummingbird that occurs in the US, and indeed is jointly the smallest hummingbird in the world, together with a bee hummingbird, which occurs in the West Indies. On the right is a broad-billed hummingbird, and the one at the bottom is a striped-tailed hummingbird from Costa Rica. So, as I said, 31 species. Interestingly, if you go east of San Antonio, typically you will only find ruby-throated hummingbirds. Okay, yes, there's the odd rufous, there's the odd broad, buff-bellied, broad-billed, but typically it's only ruby throats. In the east, in the west is where we find all the other species, except a couple that are US island and endemics of the West Indies. Size-wise, they run from anything from 2.5, 2.75 inches, all the way up to 5.5 inches. Interestingly, both the smallest, the calliope, and the largest, the blue-throated and the riverlies and the amethyst-throated, all occur to some degree in Texas. As I said, west of San Antonio for all the other species, typically. Again, a few pictures. You've got a calliope, a rufous, and a Costa's hummingbird on the right there. So I said that hummingbirds only occur in the New World. What's interesting is most of the fossils occur in the Old World. Okay, so the oldest New World fossil, i.e. the oldest fossil of a hummingbird found in the Americas, is from Mexico, and he's only 1.8 million years old. I should hesitate here. If any of you ever get to go to Mexico again, please don't buy hummingbird fossils. There is a roaring trade in fake hummingbird fossils in Mexico, and believe me, they're all fake. However, the oldest hummingbird ancestor was found in Germany and is 47 million years old. There are also a few examples from France and Belgium, that are 30 million years or so old. How do we know they're hummingbirds? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, the bone of the lower beak or maxilla has a hole in it which the tongue goes through. And we'll talk about the tongue of hummingbirds a little bit later. The wing structure is very important. We're going to talk a lot about that, where the bird's wrist lies. And probably most conclusively, in the fossil hummingbirds, there is pollen present in the fossil stomach. There are no other birds you would ever find that in. So we know that those are hummingbird fossils. Now, obviously, the continent split long before 47 million years ago. It's likely that hummingbirds in the old world died out due to the temperatures and the lack of nectar-bearing plants to sustain them. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about hummingbird physiology. Here's a hummingbird skeleton. We'll talk about the tongue and beak, as we said, the lower maxilla, the brain and the eyes, the muscle and the wings, and the heart and blood, and the legs and feet. So first off, this fossil is very different from any other bird fossil. I first draw your attention to the tongue, and it's fossilized. So hummingbirds have a bone in their tongue, which we'll talk about. Next, I draw your attention to the muscle and wings, and you can see the huge sternum bone by the rib cage there, and that's to support the huge muscles that it takes to fly. And the other thing that's very noticeable here is the size of the head and the brain and the eyes. And I ask you to bear all of those in mind as we go through each one. So let's look at the lower maxilla or beak and its tongue. So hummingbirds, as we've said, feed primarily on nectar. A lot of people think they suck nectar up into their beaks and down to their stomach. That's not true. What they actually do is flick their tongue in and out. As it goes out, the nectar flows into little pockets in the tongue, and as it draws it back in, the nectar is pushed down its throat. It does that about 20 times a second. This is a relatively recent discovery in the last 5 years. And for those people who'd like to read more, the paper is called Hummingbird Tongues or Elastic Micropumps. My advice is just to read the synopsis. Don't read the whole thing because you'll be very confused by the end of it. The picture in the lower right, by the way, is an electron microscope picture of a hummingbird with its tongue out. And you can see the two filament-like extensions at the end. Those are what the nectar flows into before it draws it into the beak. Now, we said that hummingbirds have a bony tongue. The picture top left is actually a picture of the jaw and the tongue inside its beak. And you can see the bony structure. Let me see if I can put my mouse on it. Just here, you can see the bony structure of the tongue. Now, where does that tongue go to? It actually goes, as we said, through the bottom of the beak, which you can see here on bottom right, and it wraps all the way around its head and attaches behind its eye. And you can see the parts of the tongue in this skeleton here on the top. This is actually looking down on the skull, and you can see the tongue wrapping around to go under the beak and out. Is this unique in hummingbirds? The only other birds group that has a tongue like this are woodpeckers. And if you imagine woodpeckers are sticking their tongue under bark to try and pull insects out, you can see why they have a similar evolutionary development. Hummingbird tongues can be 3 times the length of the bill. And I don't know any human beings who have quite that long a tongue. If we look at the heart and the blood now, a hummingbird heart is very, very similar to a human heart and very similar to most other birds. The difference being for its size, it's huge. It is the heaviest heart of any bird or animal at 2.5% its body weight. That might not sound a lot, but your heart's probably 1/50th of your body, sorry, more than that, 1/500th of your body weight. Heart beats 250 beats a minute resting and 1200 to 1250 beats a minute when flying. And for that reason, hummingbird blood has the highest red blood cell count of any animal or bird, because it's running on overdrive. It has to transport oxygen, food at a very, very rapid rate. Now, what happens when it can't? Hummingbirds have the ability to slow their metabolism down, and they go into what's called torpor. So if you ever have a frost in your garden and there are still hummingbirds around, or were before it got cold, if you take a look under branches and leaves, you might find a hummingbird you think's dead hanging upside down. He's not dead. He's just slowed his metabolism down and gone into a virtual state of hibernation or torpor. And they will be fine as long as it warms up fairly quickly for them to feed again. So muscles and wings. We talked a little bit about the huge sternum bone, which I'll come to in a minute. But first of all, let's take a look at the wings. On the left here, you can see this is a hummingbird wing, and this is a typical bird's wing. This is actually from a pelican. If you look, you can see on a hummingbird, nearly all its arm or wing, if you like, is tucked into its body, and it actually only flaps from its wrist and fingers. Most other birds use their full arm, full wing. Hummingbirds only their fingers and wrist. And this is what we were talking about, the humeral tendon. That's what controls this joint, and it's different in hermit hummingbirds to traditional or typical hummingbirds. Why is this so important? Well, this is why it can fly in any direction, because it has ultimate control over its fingers and the feathers attached to them. So it truly can fly in any direction. While I'm on the subject, hummingbirds have the least feathers of any bird around, typically in the range of 900, which is a very small number compared to most birds. So here's the wing. As I said, average for a hummingbird 15 to 60, but it can do 200 beats a second. And as some of you know, and we'll talk about later, hummingbirds migrate. They can fly at 85 kilometers an hour, just over 60 miles an hour, which for a bird that's between 3 and 5 inches is truly fast. Okay, moving on to that sternum we talked about and the chest muscles. What you can see here, this is the sternum bone, and this is the muscle that's attached. No other bird has any sort of musculature that would drive the wing as hard as hummingbird for its size. They're truly massive compared to any other bird. And as we talked about, the specialized humerus joint gives them a full 360-degree movement. Again, they can fly in any direction. And interestingly, in the Middle Ages, people actually thought when they moved to the Americas that hummingbirds were actually insects at the start. The reason being that their flight is more insect-like than bird-like. And if anybody's watched a bee or a wasp closely, you'll see that the way they beat their wings and the way they maneuver them around, hummingbirds are much more like insects than normal birds. Okay, so moving along to the brain and the eyes and the legs and the feet. Okay, its legs are very short. Remember I said apodiformes means no feet. They are very light and they're pretty much useless. They only perch on them and occasionally scratch with them. If you watch most birds take off, they launch into flight using their leg muscles and legs. Hummingbirds can't do that. Their takeoff is purely driven through wing power and those large chest muscles. Really, they have no ability to leap or jump or launch themselves into flight. Their brain is incredibly large for the size of the bird. It's about just over 4% of the total body weight. It is by far the largest brain in the avian world when compared to its total body mass. And its eyes are incredibly large, again, with relation to the size. It has binocular vision in front of it and monocular vision to the sides. Hummingbirds have a huge or high number of, high concentration of rods and cones in their eyes. The spectrum they see in is much wider than ours. They typically see in ultraviolet and infrared, and their eyesight is truly excellent. If you ever try and reach out and catch a hummingbird, I guarantee it will move out of the way. That's because both its binocular and monocular vision are truly excellent due to this high concentration of rods and cones. All right, let's move along and talk about hummingbird iridescence. 1 second. So everybody knows hummingbirds from their bright colors. And when you catch them, especially typical hummingbirds, when you catch them in their right light, their gorget flashes, their throat flashes. This is some recent work done into feathers as to why this is so. So what was found is that there are 3 types of feathers in hummingbirds. There are feathers that have a hollow multi-layer. There are feathers that have a solid multi-layer construction, and there are feathers that are mixed. Okay, hollow multi-layer feathers will iridesce regardless of the light direction on them. So if you remember the hermit at the very start, it was green and it was iridescent green, but it won't change with movement. A solid multi-layer type will not iridesce. It's like a normal bird feather. The mixed multi-layer type will iridesce or flash when you are at the right angle for that flash to occur. So we've all watched ruby-throated hummingbirds in our garden. We think, what's the big deal? Its throat's not really ruby red. And then suddenly you'll get the right incidence of light, and it is startlingly bright. That is because you are at the right angle to the mixed multi-layer type of feather. So what else can happen? Well, the picture on the right here shows what they call here the vannular angle, which is the angle you're seeing the light at. When you hit the vannular angle, it flashes. If you're not at the vannular angle, it won't iridesce unless it's a truly hollow type feather, which iridesces all the time. Now, the scientific list on the left I picked two species out, which I'll talk about in a minute. There are, or has been, a lot of research into which hummingbirds have which sort of feathers. Hermits typically do not, or they iridesce, but they iridesce all the time because they don't have the mixed multilayer of feathers. They only have the hollow type. Typical hummingbirds have all three types, but the mixed multilayer is the gorget, is on its throat, and that's what flashes. This has led to some reclassification of hummingbirds. It's going on, and it's one of the reasons I said at the start, anywhere between 290 and 360 species, depending on who you believe. Right now, we sit at something like 328. That number will change. For the anoraks amongst you who like the scientific papers, the paper is called Hummingbird Iridescence, an unsuspected structural diversity influences coloration at multiple scales. Again, please just read the synopsis. Don't read the whole paper. I tried, and I realized I need a PhD in mathematics to understand it. But the reference is there just in case you'd like to take a look. So, as we looked at the start, hermits on the left, hollow type feathers in the main, they iridesce continually. Typical hummingbirds on the right, it's their gorget, typically that iridesces, sometimes the cap and the back. Those are the mixed multi-layer feathers. The ones that don't iridesce at all are the solid type feathers. So if we look at this rufous hummingbird here, you know, this is probably mixed multi-layer. Some of the feathers, the head and the crown and the back will iridesce all the time. Those are the hollow multi-layer. And then, you know, the plain chest, some of the wing feathers that don't iridesce at all, they are the solid multi-layer feathers. I make a big deal of this because hummingbird classification is going to change a whole lot more because of this discovery. This was 2016, I think it was. All right, just coming towards the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about hummingbird migration and hummingbird distribution. So as we said at the start, the only commonly occurring hummingbird in the east of the US is the ruby-throated hummingbird, seen on the map here in red. Everything else is in the west, and you can see that here. Now, hummingbird migration, ruby throats fly across the Gulf of Mexico. It's the only hummingbird that really crosses water to any great extent. It takes it about 18 hours to get from the US to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, or vice versa. You know, for a bird that is about 3.5, 4 inches long, that's an amazing feat. All hummingbirds, all other hummingbirds, should I say, are land-bound migrants and run down the west coast and around the landmass. So actually, ruby throats are the only ones that make this huge ocean crossing. So my picture's on the right here. This is a rufous hummingbird. This is a typically western hummingbird, would fly down the coast and is landlocked. The bottom one is a ruby throat, and that actually flies across the Gulf of Mexico. Do hummingbirds stay around for the winter in the Gulf Coast? There are a few that hang around. So there'll be a few ruby throats. Occasionally there'll be the odd rufous. If anybody's been to the valley, they'll know that the buff-bellied hummingbird occurs there. Buff-bellied hummingbirds are very strange. They migrate north for the winter. So our chances of seeing, not very far north, by the way, it's pretty localized, but our chances of seeing a buff-bellied hummingbird in our part of the world is typically at its greatest in the winter. Those of you who go to Quintana now again might remember there was a buff-bellied hummingbird that hung around all last winter, basically because we were filling the feeder every day. So, given that migration, let's talk a little bit just to finish on how how human activity affects hummingbirds. Number one, the range of hummingbirds is moving further to the north and south as the flora and the insect ranges change. That means it's further to migrate. Why are the flora and the insect ranges moving further north and south? Due to climate change. We can argue about whether it's man-made or naturally occurring, but there is no doubt that the world is generally becoming warmer, and that is causing the flora and the insect range to change, which means hummingbirds have to change. The other problem with that is that it's pushing more species together. So they're having overlapping ranges all of a sudden. And that means a lot more competition for food and territory. Like all other birds, breeding and winting ground habitat is disappearing. Some of you might know, and it says so at the bottom there, bird numbers are down by 70% plus since the 1970s. Some species are down 90% plus. The majority of this is due to habitat loss. But certainly the stuff we've talked about with the climate already is having an effect. Not only are the ranges of the food supply changing, but flower blooming times and insect hatching times are changing. And that is causing a scarcity of food on their migration routes. So everybody needs to understand migration is a carefully timed process to ensure that there's a food supply for the birds that are migrating along their route. If flower blooming and insect hatching times start to change, it might mean, or can and does mean, that sometimes on the migration route there is no food supply, and that means the bird dies. And we saw from the map earlier, most hummingbird species are centered around the tropics. Unfortunately, the tropics, Central and South America, is where the largest habitat loss is occurring. So we really are not helping hummingbirds and indeed birds in general at the moment. And that's why it's so important that we preserve habitats and that we all do our bit. So, you know, we put feeders out and we plant flowers that are attractive to hummingbirds to see them. But honestly, it's a vital task to preserve the numbers of hummingbirds as they fly north and south. So just to finish, hummingbirds are truly amazing. This picture, by the way, is my all-time favorite hummingbird picture I've taken. This is a rufous hummingbird, in fact, a pair of rufous hummingbirds. The one on the left was at a feeder. The feeder was full and the one on the right decided it was time for it to move. So pecked it on the back of the neck to make it leave the feeder to open up a slot. As an aside, most of the photos you've seen today are for sale in the GCBO store. There is also a 2021 calendar, GCBO calendar, that is all hummingbird pictures. Please go to the online store and take a look. All the proceeds go to GCBO. And finally, if you'd like to see more pictures, this is my website here. I think I have about 7,000 bird pictures on there. And they're not all hummingbirds, obviously, but please feel free to take a look and make any comments you feel. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your participation. And if you have any questions, please fire away.